Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Week 5 lecture modules. So this week we are, and next week in this unit, we will be talking about race. So how do we define race? Well, a race is a human group that defines itself and or is defined by other groups as different by virtue of innate and immutable physical characteristics, such as hair type and skin color, shape of eyes and nose, things like that. And this is a group that is socially defined on the basis of physical criteria, which is formally called phenotype. So when you see the word phenotype, that just means your physical appearance. But physical appearance as in the hair color, the things that you're born with, not physical appearance as in how well you dress. Now, racialization is a process. It's a social process, and it's the construction of a separate social category that's based on race. And it includes an ideological component that we find in cultural representations. So what do novels say about this group of people? How are they portrayed in audiovisual media or in images? What are the stereotypes that the culture has about this group? And then there's a structural component, and that's how are they treated under the law? What are some of the institutional norms that, while they may not be strict laws, they're ordinary practices with respect to that group? So we've got cultural and institutional, and in this class, we will be talking a little bit about the cultural, but mainly looking at the institutional side of things, because it's the institutional, the different treatments by institutions that really make society very unequal. Okay, so the first film of this unit is our Week 5 film on race. It's called The Uncomfortable Truth. It came out in 2017, and it's produced by Loki Mulholland, who is the son of civil rights activist Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, and he's also a descendant of Virginia and Georgia slave owners. Now, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, when she was just Joni Trumpauer, was one of the white students who was very active in the civil rights era protests. She was one of the freedom riders. She engaged in the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins. She did the voting registration, the outreach to get African Americans across the South registered to vote. She was arrested a number of times and really went against her family's background to fight for equal rights. Now, in the film, Loki uses his family's history because one of his great-great-grandfathers was among some of the first slave owners in Virginia. And so he traces back and he looks at his family to personalize the issues of racial inequality in America. And he focuses on this one former slave that they called Aunt Mary, who was there sometimes more verbally in the stories. She only shows up in the census once, and she doesn't get buried in the family plot. And that really bothers him. And I think one reason why this bothers him is the way that we treat our burial. We don't bury pets in human cemeteries, right? So the fact that Mary, this former slave, who was called Aunt Mary, which he believes meant that she had some kind of kinship relationship because of, being the product, say, of the slave owner raping one of the slave women, this woman who is somehow related to him was not considered human enough to be buried in the family plot. And so this is a big thing in the movie that Loki really gets bothered about, that this is how his family has treated blacks. Then it's not just from the white side of things. One of Joni's friends from the civil rights era, the activist Luvon Brown, then comes in and tells his side of the story of racism in the U.S. from the African American point of view, and he tells us what it was like to grow up in Mississippi under Jim Crow, and how long it took him to accept Joni as a white person who was genuinely there fighting for the rights of African Americans. So as you watch this film, and while you're taking notes for your memo, think about how and why racial inequality in the U.S. began. Think about how this inequality has been maintained and reinforced over time. What are some of the material effects of racial inequality in the U.S.? And what do the Mulhollands and Luvon Brown suggest is the solution to racism and inequality? Now, it's really important to think about it. These people are very, very honest about being in a racist society and working against that racist society and trying to dismantle racism in the Deep South, because this is where they were from. And Luvon Brown states that the biggest improvements in social inequalities in the U.S. have happened when the working class and middle class people of all races work together for their common interest, as they did in the 1960s and 1970s. And these were the times when great improvements were made in economic programs to help the poor and to also expand the rights and expand equal treatment of people of all races and genders, and also sexual orientations. So if you look at what was going on in the 1960s and 70s, there were economic programs to help all classes so it was trying to undo inequality on the axes of class, race, gender, with the second wave feminist movement, and then also you had the gay pride movement. That was when Pride parades started. So all of these things happened, and you also had the environmental movement and protecting the environment. You had the Native American spiritual reawakening. So there was this big time in the 60s and 70s when there was a real serious attempt from grassroots efforts by people coming together and forming coalitions and working to make the U.S. a more just and a fairer and equal society. But Brown concludes this section of his discourse with a comment that whenever a leader arises who can unite the middle and lower classes of all races, they get assassinated. And some of the examples that he cites are Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Fred Hampton, and Mark Clark. And these were all leaders in the 60s and 70s. Many were black, but there were, Robert Kennedy was white, who were working to unite everyone among the working class, the middle classes, and to work to eliminate poverty and eliminate inequality, or to reduce inequality in our society. Now, the other thing that both Brown and the Mulhollands are very open about is how they were socialized to dislike people of other races. And the Mulhollands even talk about how now, after, like Joni's been working since the 1950s to try and undo racism in America, but she still finds that what she learned as a girl in a racist Southern white family is something that she has to actively resist. And so they are very open about needing to actively resist racist attitudes. Okay, so that's all for the first module of our lecture.